What's good, YouTube? This is Boxingwave, and we are back with another fight breakdown. This will be my fifth breakdown for tomorrow's Day of Reckoning card. All right. This is actually one of the better matchups on the entire card. I think the most even matchups, and this is where we can possibly get an upset. I think out of the first or the top four fights, which I already did breakdowns for, I think the most competitive or even matchup going into the fight is definitely Daniel Dubois against Gerald Miller. I think that's a 50-50 fight. You could go either way with that one. But this fight here, as far as the undercard, between the fight with Filip Hrgović, Frank Sanchez, and Jai Opetaia, I think that this fight is the most even fight out of the preliminary fights. All right, so you got Arslanbek Makhmudov. He's going to be facing off against Agit Kabayel. All right, the German fighter. You got a boxer versus a puncher. Arslanbek, huge fighter. He's probably like at least 6'6" as far as height. Big puncher. He's been knocking everybody out. Out of the 18 wins, he's knocked out 17 of his opponents. The only fighter that was able to go the distance with him was Carlos Takam, and he dropped Takam a couple of times in that fight. All right, but it was a very, very competitive fight. And I did go back, check it out, did my film study on that one to prepare for this one. When it came to Kabayel, I kind of bounced around. I went to some of his older fights. I did see his most recent fight against Makiki. I did rewatch some of the Derek Chisora fight. I remember watching that fight at that time, so I didn't watch the whole entire fight, but I bounced around there just to see how he would deal with a pressure fighter. And I would keep it straight. I don't need to make it really long because I know exactly what both fighters need to do. One thing about Arslanbek that I haven't really given him that much credit for is that when I rewatched the Carlos Takam fight, I noticed that he kind of changed his approach after the first 3 or 4 rounds, okay, where he was more focused on distance and timing and not just fighting like an animal. The first round or two in most of his fights, he's fighting kind of wild, right? He's super aggressive. He's fighting like a brawler. He's not really trying to box like that. He's a bigger guy. He's fighting. Even when he's fought other big guys, he's been coming out very aggressive and overpowering everybody he's faced. He did it to Takam, and he did get a knockdown in the first round. But I think when things slowed down a little bit, Carlos was able to box and land some big shots, big overhand rights, consistently throughout the remainder of the fight. Carlos Takam, a lot of respect. He's been in there with everyone. He's been knocked out before. He's lost fights, but he's won some big fights too. And one thing about Takam is that he's a survivor. He knows, he has the experience to know how to deal with aggressive fighters. You know what I mean? He was able to survive a lot of fights, and I think with Arslanbek, you can see in that fight, even though he lost the fight, he was able to survive and still be competitive. And at points, he was able to back down for countless rounds. He was able to back down Arslanbek, who was a much bigger man, because I thought that he had more tools as far as boxing to deal with Arslanbek. Arslanbek, I still think, even though I give him a little bit more credit because he did box in certain points of that fight, I still think he's kind of limited. He doesn't use his jab that much. He uses it just to follow it up with the right hand. He does have a good left hook. He knows how to time it and counter. I saw him countering Takam's jab with the left hook. And I saw sometimes when Takam would lunge in and try to exchange with him, he would counter. He would step back and counter with the backhand, right hand, So I think he has some technique in his game. Doesn't move his head much, very, very tall, but he would apply some of those tall guy tactics like Klitschko or even like Fury, where, guys will get in and he will kind of lean over them or tie up with them in order to make sure that Takam wouldn't do too much work on the inside. And you got Kabayel, where I've seen different versions of him with each fight. You know, I've seen him be aggressive in a Smekiki fight. Smekiki, the last opponent. That was just a full-out war. Like, so if you're just basing it on the Derek Chisora fight, if you want to see a different version of him, I would go to his very last fight, because in his very last fight, these guys started throwing hands right from the get-go. In the earliest round, these guys were trading, and Kabayel was the one that was coming forward. And it turned into a slugfest, and he ended up stopping his opponent in the third round. But he was hurt in that fight, and he did take a lot of hits in that war that they had. But then when you go to the Derek Chisora fight, we see a lot of lateral move. I mean, he's moving. I mean, at some points, he's moving so much it looks like he's running. And I remember watching that fight live and even rewatching it a little bit today. I just feel like Derek Chisora looked very unmotivated. Just comparing his performance in that fight against the ones that he had after that fight. So even though that fight was still very close, the judges' scorecards was very close in that win against Derek Chisora, I can tell that Chisora really didn't look that motivated. I've seen him look more motivated against Usyk, Joseph Parker, some of the other fights he's had since that fight. So with that being said, this fight can go in a couple of ways, in a few ways, in my opinion. I think Kabayel has less room to make mistakes. And I think in order for him to win this fight, and it's not like he doesn't have power. I mean, the guy, he's 31 years old. He's been boxing since 2011. He has a solid amount of knockouts in his resume, but he doesn't have top quality opponents in his resume consistently. He doesn't fight as much. He's been fighting longer, but it appears that he fights pretty much like once a year, and the most recent fights hasn't really been that good as far as the opposition, where I feel like Makhmudov has been fighting, Urban Tepper. He's fought Carlos Takam. He's fought a few other guys, Marius Walk. He's fought some guys that's been in there with like champions. He's been in there with a few guys. So what I will say is that Makhmudov is definitely more active. He's 34 years old, so he has to be. He's fighting at least 2 or 3 times a year in the last few years. So he's definitely active. He's definitely getting experience up. I don't know much about him as an amateur. All right, but as a pro, he seems to be extremely active. So I think for Kabayel, in order for him to win this fight, I think he needs to start out moving. He has to start out moving. Give the first couple of rounds away if you have to, just based on moving and boxing. All right, but a lot of movement. Makhmudov is very aggressive in the opening rounds. He's more like Daniel Dubois. Similar thing I was saying about him against Gerald Miller and other breakdowns that I've done of him. Daniel Dubois is more aggressive very early in the earlier rounds. I think that's the point where Kabayel needs to use a lot of lateral movement. Just get out of the way, use a defense, tie up if you have to. Let Makhmudov slow down. Yes, get your shots in here and there. Pot shot if you have to a little bit. Use some countering tactics and stuff. But in a very early opening round or two, use that lateral movement. Phase 2 is starting to box. All right? Box a little bit. Counter. Throw some more combinations. He's good at combinations. He's not really that explosive, but he does know how to put his punches together pretty well. He goes to the body. He has a decent jab, and again, he's pretty good at controlling distance, right? And then in phase 3, if we're that far, because we're talking about Arslanbek again, if he's going that far and we're getting into the 5th, 6th, 7th round, this is a 10-rounder. At that point, he needs to start coming forward, because I think Takam had a lot of success when he was coming forward, and Arslanbek was starting to focus on timing and countering, and that's where things wasn't really working out for him, because Arslanbek kind of keeps his hands down. So he left himself open for Takam. Takam kept feinting, and timing that big overhand club and right hand. and it worked out for him for a lot of those rounds. Unfortunately, he got knocked down twice in that fight. So as far as the points, he lost the match, but he was having a lot of success and being consistent when he started coming forward and jumping and lunging in with those lead left hooks and using his jab and throwing those big overhand rights. He knew how to close distance so fast. I don't know if Kabayel is able to do that because at least I didn't have a lot of time to do as much film study as I normally would. But from what I've seen, it doesn't look like he's as explosive or as fast as Carlos Takam was when it came to closing distance. He could be, and he could display that in this fight. He would need to in order to win. But I think for Kabayel to win, he needs to do that sequence. Survive the onslaught in the first couple rounds. And then after that, start boxing a little bit, work on your counters, and then in the last half of the fight or so, try to come forward. Don't go into full-blown exchanges with Makhmudov because that's what he wants to do. But I think he needs to pick his points where he is coming forward and he is being the aggressor. All right, but staying out of danger. The less knockouts, the better. Knockdowns. The less knockdowns would be the best for him. It's like I feel like he has to fight a perfect fight strategically, and I think he's capable of doing it. But will he be able to do it? Because Arslanbek is a beast. Now the thing with Arslanbek, yes, he's gonna come in like a wild man, try to destroy him. That's the way he is. Even if you listen to him in his interviews, he just wants to destroy everybody. He thinks he could beat everybody, and he's going to try to do that. But at some point, he might have to box. And if that doesn't work out, he might have to box. And I think the lack of his jab is part of the problem. I think he needs to start using his jab a little bit more and stop just focusing on just the 1-2 over and over again. A lot of these big heavyweights, I was saying this about Daniel Dubois, Efe Jagba. I've been saying this for years now about him. They need to add more to their arsenal instead of just the 1-2. We know you got a big right hand. He has a good hook, but for the most part, he's looking to throw the right hand and then get into these wars and just overpower his opponents. In this case, if he happens to start getting outboxed a little bit, then he has to be smart and work on some of his tactics. And I think personally, overall, boxing, Kabayel beats him. But brawling, Makhmudov is going to win that kind of fight. But use those tactics, those big man tactics. Lean on them if you have to. If you're getting outboxed, throw off the rhythm of Kabayel. Make him force him to try to fight your fight. And that goes the same for a lot of these fights that's on this card. Same thing with Dubois and Gerald Miller. Miller has to get Dubois to fight his fight and go into these exchanges in the later rounds because we know that most likely in the long run, Gerald Miller will probably favor him, being that he's a much bigger guy. He's 100 pounds bigger than Daniel Dubois. So with this fight here, same thing. It's just, as far as the pick, this was in the beginning, this was the fight that I was leaning on an upset. I did pick Miller to win against Dubois, so that is, technically it is an upset because even though Miller is not a big underdog here, he is a slight underdog. I just don't know enough about Kabayel and how he would deal with this fight and wanting to pick him. I'm not confident enough in picking him. I do think that he has some talent, and I do think he's capable of winning the fight, especially if this guy, Makhmudov, slows down in the second half. I can see him outboxing him, but I just don't see the intensity. I was watching this Makiki fight. He was just getting touched up too much in that kind of fight. I just think I still have to go with Arslanbek, even if it's a little bit controversial or even if it's a little competitive and it does go to distance. I just think Arslanbek is just too big, too powerful, and most likely Kabayel, who's probably going to move a lot early on, the moment that he begins to trade and exchange with Arslanbek, he's going to have some trouble. And I just see Arslanbek pulling off the win. Not sure by knockout or not. I can see this going to the cards, but Arslanbek can win by knockout if Kabayel decides to scrap with him. If he turns into a dogfight, I see Makhmudov winning the fight by KO. But if Arslanbek is being defensive and if he's in survival mode, he may go the distance and lose. But regardless, I have Makhmudov winning the fight. It could be an upset. It's definitely a good matchup. It's probably a sleeper. I can also see this being, I say it's a sleeper and it should be a good fight, but I can also see it being a boring fight. I can see a lot of holding going on because one thing about Kabayel was when he fought Derek Chisora, he was doing a lot of holding. It wasn't really a good fight. And Arslanbek, at the same thing with Carlos Takam, it was a lot of holding, it was a lot of leaning on his part. So I say it's a sleeper because it could be a competitive fight, but I also think that it may not really be that good of a fight, especially if Kabayel is going to be as strategic and fight a perfect type of fight. In order for him to win, he would have to use certain tactics in order to survive. So anyway, I got Arslanbek winning this one. It's definitely the best matchup on the undercard as far as the bottom tier undercard. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will be here covering the fight, the entire fight tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.